Hi, everybody. In a world drowning in propaganda, fear, and carefully manufactured narratives, very few people are willing to tell you what is actually happening behind the headlines. Today, I want to step away from the slogans, the sound bites, and the emotional manipulation to look calmly and directly at the hard strategic reality. The true state of the war in Ukraine, the collapse of Western strategy, the rise of Russia as a decisive power, and the dangerous games being played in the Middle East. This is not about wishful thinking or political fashion. It is about facts, military logic, and consequences. If you are ready to question what you have been told and confront the uncomfortable truth about the American empire, Europe, Israel, and Russia, then let's begin. I look at what is happening now around Ukraine, Russia, Trump, and Europe, and I do not see a chaotic collection of random events. I see a very clear strategic picture. Russia has effectively won the war on the ground. The West is struggling to digest that reality. And a messy, improvised attempt at a political settlement is being pushed forward mainly by Washington and Moscow, with Europe reduced to a bystander that still hasn't understood how irrelevant it has become. The recent meeting between Viktor Orban and Vladimir Putin is not some isolated curiosity. It sits in the same frame as the planned and then postponed idea of a Trump-Putin summit in Budapest, the 28-point Trump plan, and the shuttle diplomacy of people like Steve Witkoff, Daniel Driscoll, and others. The key point is this. There is a plan, or at least a set of talking points coming from the United States. It has been modified on the fly in Geneva and elsewhere, and it is now being placed in front of the Russians. Moscow is looking at it calmly from a position of strength. From the very beginning, I have refused to dismiss this latest initiative as dead on arrival. You cannot pronounce something dead before it even lands on the table. The talking points are now arriving in the person of Witkoff in Moscow, probably Monday or Tuesday. The urgency is obvious. Trump is pushing this very hard, and Putin is playing along because Moscow understands perfectly well that it can use Washington's internal needs to consolidate its win on the ground. Putin literally cut short a trip in Central Asia to hurry back to Moscow, gave a large press conference, and said, in essence, I'm ready, I'll be here, I have to go to India on the 3rd, but I'm prepared to talk on the basis of what was agreed in Anchorage. Two key things came out of that Anchorage framework. First, Trump dropped the naive idea of an instant ceasefire and shifted to going for the whole package, a comprehensive settlement, not just a pause in the shooting. Second, he undertook not to let Zelensky or anyone else in Kiev sabotage progress. He then failed to enforce that second part. He wasn't ruthless enough or smart enough or simply too divided internally. Putin has called him on that. Moscow's position now is, we're ready to discuss, but the basis has to be what we agreed in Anchorage, including the exclusion of Ukrainian veto players from torpedoing the deal. If Washington can control its own satraps, we will listen. Behind all of this is a simple, brutal reality that Trump has openly acknowledged Russia has won. On that plane, going down to Florida for Thanksgiving, you could barely hear him over the background noise, but the message was clear. The Russians are in control here. You want to lose 50, 60,000 more people, or do you want a deal? That is not some abstract opinion. That is a recognition of facts on the ground. So why the sudden rush? Why the flurry of visits, calls, and meetings? In part, because Trump lusts after a Nobel Peace Prize. That may sound trivial in the world of realpolitik, but the Nobel nomination window opened in mid-October and closes at the end of January. That timing absolutely helps explain the urgency. The main driver is Russia's military victory, but Trump's vanity and craving for recognition are very real accelerators. If peace in Ukraine is the price of his ego being stroked, frankly, so be it. The British, as usual, are clucking in the background that this is no way to conduct diplomacy, that it is chaotic, improper, and so on. Yes, but it is Trump. The core fact is that Putin is not dismissing the initiative. He is effectively saying, come on then, Send Witkoff. Let's hear what you have to say. Let's see if we can get this damn war over. That alone tells you how confident Russia is in its position. Inside the United States, there is a real split. On one side, you have Trump, J.D. Vance, Witkoff, Driscoll, and others who clearly want to wrap this up, accept reality, and pivot. On the other side, you have Marco Rubio, people embedded in the intelligence apparatus, the CIA leadership, and the usual establishment hawks who are desperate to prevent any real reconciliation with Moscow. They want to maintain the fiction that the West can still save Ukraine if it just doubles down once more. Look at the recent pattern. Rubio goes to Geneva, talks with Ukrainians, Europeans, and Swiss. It's mostly a sop to European sensibilities, a way of saying, look, you're consulted, you're in the loop, when in reality, Europe has no decisive role. Then Driscoll, a close associate of J.D. Vance and now Secretary of the Army, goes straight to Kyiv. And what does he tell them? In diplomatic language, effectively, it's over. The war is lost. Russia is producing missiles and rockets in such quantity, they are literally running out of storage space. The front lines are collapsing. Face reality. At the same time, he chases down a separate track in Abu Dhabi where Russian and Ukrainian representatives are quietly handling prisoner swaps and remains. He tries to insert himself there, only to be politely told that the real action is happening elsewhere. They are waiting for Witkoff in Moscow. The message to Washington's own mid-level players is clear. Your improvisations and side channels are irrelevant. The core negotiation is going to be led at the top between Trump's envoys and the Kremlin. Parallel to this, the anti-corruption campaign in Ukraine has been unleashed, and crucially, not by some spontaneous local awakening, but by institutions designed and penetrated long ago by Western intelligence. Nabu in Kyiv was built with the help of the CIA and other Western services. Does anyone seriously think they set this thing up without leaving microphones, informants, and control mechanisms all over it? Of course not. Now, those tools are being used to expose corruption everyone always knew existed. The resignation of Yermak, Zelensky's powerful chief of staff and key fixer, is a symptom of that. These raids and investigations are not a moral crusade. They are a political instrument. They weaken Zelensky, signal to Europe that they have been pouring billions into a black hole of theft, and prepare the ground for Washington to say, we discovered terrible corruption, we had to clean house, and now we need a new arrangement. Europe, complicit in that corruption network, will have a hard time explaining to its voters how their money vanished into villas, offshore accounts, and luxury lifestyles in Kyiv. Zelensky himself has no real cards left. He can be brave, he can be tragic, but he has no strategic leverage. If Washington tells him to fight, he fights. If Washington tells him to stop, he stops. He is not the protagonist of this story. He is the expendable face the West put on a proxy war. Trump could have ended this conflict many months ago simply by cutting off weapons, money, and intelligence. He is only now seriously exploring that option because the political and strategic calculus has shifted. And where is Europe in all this? Nowhere. It has no money. It has no serious armies. It has no credible independent nuclear deterrent under its own political control. It has no coherent plan and no shared sense of purpose. Its leaders bicker over procedure and internal power. Look at the tensions between von der Leyen and other EU office holders. While parroting absurd talking points that if Ukraine falls today, Russian tanks will roll into Berlin tomorrow and Chinese troops will land in Taiwan the day after. This is hysterical nonsense. The infamous line from Victoria Nuland, F. The EU has never been more relevant. Washington's underlying attitude has not changed. The EU is useful as a source of funds and as a political echo chamber. But when it comes to serious strategic decisions, especially now, the United States will do what it wants. If Trump decides to say, to hell with the EU, to hell with Zelensky, we are ending this on terms agreed with Moscow, what exactly can Brussels do? Scream, issue statements, shuffle papers? They have neither the military force nor the political cohesion to block a peace deal backed by the United States and accepted by Russia. In fact, the current EU leadership knows perfectly well that if Ukraine collapses completely, it will not only be the end of NATO as we have known it, it could be the end of the old EU elite as well. People like von der Leyen are not just fighting for European values, they are fighting for their own careers. If voters in Europe fully grasp that their leaders destroyed their economies, sabotaged their energy security, and funneled billions into the most corrupt state in Europe, all to lose against Russia, the political reckoning will be brutal. NATO is already finished in practical terms. Remember the previous NATO summit where they declared that Ukraine had an irreversible path to membership? At the most recent summit, that phrase simply vanished. Nothing. Silence. The alliance is splintered. Hungary, Slovakia, and others are openly obstructing escalation. Economies are under severe strain. Article 5, the so-called sacred mutual defense guarantee, has become a bad joke. Does anyone actually believe that the United States in its current condition would go to war with Russia for the sake of Germany, especially in some ambiguous provocation where it is not even clear who fired first? No serious person does. So we see the outlines of the future. NATO is hollowed out. Europe is over as a serious strategic actor. And a new security architecture is emerging with Russia at the center, connected to the broader BRICS world. Trump, behind his bluster and vanity, seems to sense that reality. He understands that Russia cannot be defeated without risking nuclear war, and that the United States has to recalibrate not as a global hegemon, but as one powerful state among others. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to the end of the Cold War. There was a real opportunity for a Europe whole and free from Lisbon to Vladivostok. That wasn't some utopian dream. It was openly articulated in speeches by Western leaders. There was a serious chance for a grand security arrangement that included Russia instead of isolating it. Instead, Washington chose to exploit Russian weakness, expand NATO eastward despite explicit assurances to the contrary, and treat Moscow as a defeated colony. Russians trusted and did not verify. They expected substantial economic assistance and genuine partnership. Instead, they got shock therapy, oligarch looting, NATO expansion, the humiliation of Yeltsin, and the installation of a comprador regime aligned with Western financial interests. Putin observed all of that from the inside. Over the last 20 plus years, he has rebuilt the Russian state, the Russian military, and Russia's global position. He has done so with a clear understanding that the central reality is the nuclear balance. It must never be allowed to be destabilized in America's favor. That is precisely why Moscow has acted with such strategic patience. Russia is not seeking a direct clash with the United States. It is enforcing red lines in Ukraine and in Europe while carefully avoiding crossing thresholds that could trigger uncontrolled escalation. It would prefer something like the old Cold War framework, intense ideological and political rivalry, but with functioning diplomacy and clear rules of the game. Washington, driven by hubris and short-term political cycles, has been far less disciplined. Europe, meanwhile, is trapped in a self-destructive Russophobia that goes back not a decade, but centuries. Germany is the clearest example. Its economic model was heavily dependent on cheap Russian energy and Russian raw materials. The obvious long-term strategy, especially after the end of the Cold War, would have been a deep cooperative relationship with Moscow. Instead, Germany allowed itself to become a platform for U.S. military strategy and a hostage to American pressure. The sabotage of the pipelines was not just an attack on Russian infrastructure, it was an attack on Germany's own future. It is no accident that for the first time since World War II, reputable polling in Russia shows that Germans, not Americans, are now perceived as the main enemy. That is a profound shift. It reflects both historical memory and the sense that German elites have not only betrayed their own people, but actively joined a campaign to strangle Russia economically and strategically. At the same time, Eastern Germans, who knew the Soviet Union more directly, are significantly more open to engagement with Russia. Hungary, which was twice crushed by Soviet interventions, is now led by the one truly serious European statesman, Viktor Orban, who openly advocates working with Russia, not trying to destroy it. The same goes, in varying degrees, for parts of Central and Eastern Europe that know Russia as a reality, not as a cartoon villain. For Ukraine itself, the only viable long-term model is obvious, something like Austria or Sweden and Finland before they were foolishly dragged into NATO. A neutral state, armed enough to defend itself, but not bloated into a massive standing army that it cannot afford. The idea that a collapsing Ukrainian economy should somehow sustain 600,000, 800,000 troops is absurd. If such an army existed, it would only be viable as a NATO auxiliary, permanently armed, funded, and directed from the West, which is precisely what Russia will never accept again on its border. Neutrality has worked before. Austria prospered as a neutral state. Finland, after learning the hard way that fighting Russia head-on was suicidal, built a prosperous, stable society under a neutrality arrangement that Moscow respected. The Russians have shown they are perfectly capable of living with such arrangements when they are honored. The problem is not that neutrality is impossible. The problem is that Western elites wanted to use Ukraine as a battering ram against Russia, not as a bridge between East and West. That strategy has failed catastrophically. Now, the question is not just how to end the war, but how to save face for the West. How do you protect Trump's ego, the EU's fragile legitimacy, and NATO's symbolic status while accepting that Russia has achieved its key objectives? That is where the talks in Moscow become interesting. Putin and his team are perfectly capable of putting lipstick on the pig of Western defeat. They can allow symbolic concessions, procedural language, and various joint reconstruction formulas that let Washington and Brussels claim some sort of partial success. Take Odessa, for example. Ukraine, without any access to the sea, is not really a viable sovereign state. It becomes a landlocked ward of the EU. Russia can afford to be flexible around specific arrangements there. Customs regimes, special economic zones, joint administration of ports. If the core security requirements are met, no NATO infrastructure, no long-range strike capabilities, no hostile military alliance on its doorstep. Moscow is not looking to humiliate Europeans. The constant humiliation is coming from the European side, which day after day tries to portray Russia as weak, isolated, and doomed, in direct contradiction to reality. The Russians have already shown what reconstruction under their control looks like. Look at Mariupol. Look at what they did in Chechnya after crushing the separatist insurgency. Look at the investments in Donetsk and Lugansk regions. They have the resources, the engineering capacity, and the political will to rebuild. If the frozen Russian sovereign assets are not stolen, and the Belgians and other Europeans are increasingly aware that such theft would destroy their financial reputations, those funds could eventually, by Russian decision, be used as part of a broader reconstruction framework that integrates the new Russian territories and stabilizes what remains of Ukraine. Europe's real danger now does not lie in some mythical Russian invasion. It lies in its own leadership and in the British talent for dirty tricks. MI6 and associated services are past masters of false flag operations. We have already seen dubious drone attacks and mysterious incidents used to inflame public opinion. If an American ship in the Baltic or the Black Sea were hit in some ambiguous strike, the facts might only become clear months later. But before that, the emotional reaction could push events to the brink. One major false flag, attributed to Russia, could derail or complicate a settlement. That is a real risk, and it will require extreme vigilance from serious people in Washington who actually understand what is at stake. Through all of this, one thing stands out: Putin's behavior as a statesman. Calm, patient, focused on the long game. He understands he may have to deal with Trump for 3 more years. He knows Trump is a narcissist, delusional in many respects, but also easily manipulated through flattery and status. Putin does not need much from him beyond keeping his fingers off the nuclear codes and formally accepting a new reality in Ukraine and in Europe. For that, he is perfectly willing to indulge Trump's fantasies, up to and including a Nobel Peace Prize nomination, if that helps lock in Russia's strategic victory and reduces the risk of escalation. Russia's goal, after a settlement, is straightforward: consolidate its gains, secure its borders, stabilize its near abroad, deepen integration with the BRICS and Eurasian structures, and normalize relations with the United States on the basis of mutual deterrence and respect, not hegemony. Ukraine and the EU are secondary. Moscow does not need to destroy Europe. It is watching Europe destroy itself. The West has lost in Ukraine. That is not a matter of opinion. It is a matter of demographics, industry, logistics, and battlefield results. Russia holds the initiative and is advancing methodically. Ukraine's population has collapsed from over 40-50 million to somewhere around 20-25 million. Its infrastructure is shattered. Its elites are being eaten alive by the very corruption networks the West once nurtured. Europe has bled its arsenals dry and wrecked its own energy security. NATO's credibility is in tatters. The United States has exposed itself as an unreliable, internally divided empire that cannot actually deliver on its own rhetoric. The only rational response to that situation is to accept reality and build a new order. That is what Russia is doing. It is not bragging, not demanding surrender ceremonies on battleships, not insisting on flags being hauled down in humiliation. It is simply insisting on a hard, non-negotiable fact. Russia will not allow a hostile NATO fortress on its border. It will not allow itself to be encircled and strangled. And it will not surrender the security gains it has already achieved in Ukraine. If Washington finally internalizes that truth, then the Trump-Putin channel, for all its chaos and vanity, could produce a real turning point. Europe will protest, posture, and wring its hands. But it has no divisions, no armies, no real veto. This war will be ended by Russia and the United States, and if the West is lucky, Russia will be generous enough to make the defeat cosmetically survivable for the EU and NATO. In that sense, the world should be grateful that it is Putin sitting in the Kremlin at this moment, a leader who, despite constant vilification, has shown a level of restraint, discipline, and strategic clarity that is almost completely absent in Western capitals.